Okay, I hope you all seeing the word prologue. Yeah.
Yep, it's perfect.
Okay. So before we actually dive into the topic, I just couldn't pass this up. You know, we've gone through and talked a little bit about religion and how it's affected Russia in their new iteration. And some of it is this mystical stuff that Tim Snyder put us on to. But I just remember this. There's not much talk about religion in that autobiography that Putin wrote in 2000, just as he had reached the pinnacle of power. So anything that he tells people after 2000, you just wonder, why didn't he put it in his autobiography that he wrote when he was 48? But Putin looked him in the eye and thought he had a good sense. He thought he could see his soul. And Putin told him a story about finding a cross that his mother gave him in the ashes of that Dhaka fire that we talked about at the end of the 90s. That was only a few years before he reached power. So I thought that was interesting. I wanted to mention. Anybody else have anything they want to mention from last week? This is what I wrote you all about. A friend of mine discovered this and put me onto it. It's old. It was written in 2015, but he was pretty taken with the analysis and how it was organized. And it's Fiona Hill, who we're all familiar with, and a guy named Gaddy. And I thought I'd at least show you the table of contents. It's illustrative of their approach. You can see it's very analytical. They look at all of Yeltsin's identities and different aspects of his personality. And then they go through different stages of his life and how these characteristics come out as he engages with the world later on. So, you know, it's not certainly what I've been doing is just, hey, these things happen. Maybe these people reacted. It's not this kind of abstract analysis. I've gotten down through chapter 5, and I just say it is hard to read. I don't think this way, but embedded in this approach are all kinds of interesting facts, and you'll hear some of them today as I prepared and put them in covering the years after 2003, where we ended last time. Okay, back now on to the Ukraine.
John, I know I should interrupt that much. I actually have read that book.
Okay.
And I have to tell you, I was looking forward to it with great anticipation because for whatever reason, I'm a huge fan of Fiona Hill. But the book's impossible. It's impossible. In trying to do that analytical approach, it defies all traditional ways of writing a sort of biography. It's not on any chronological time. It keeps going back and overlaying and back and overlaying, and it's probably brilliant, but I struggled.
Okay, well, I feel better. Iko watched me. I was struggling yesterday, and by bedtime, I was a basket case.
That sounds about right.
So
she was promoting that book for quite a while, the last 2 or 3 years, but she's got a new book out, which I haven't read yet, which I'm sure is much better.
Yeah, well, my friend looked at that and thought this would be better, but we'll see.
Yeah,
well, I'm reassured. Thanks for that.
Okay.
All right. So Ukraine. I thought we'd just review a little bit. This is Russia at the peak of their power. And I say Russia, of course, I mean the Soviet Union, but certainly Fiona Hill thinks that they're one and the same in different guises. But this is beyond anything the Tsars had dreamt of. And here Putin was right on the front line, right up here in Dresden. And all of a sudden he has the rug pulled out from under him. And one by one, all these things leave. And so here we are just a couple of years ago, and the people that have joined NATO. And I'm going to go over the 4 waves of people joining NATO. And I'm not, I want to emphasize, I'm not going to do it in a way of justifying anything that Putin has done, right? But it's hard to talk about him now that we know how ruthless he is. But we're going to work our way through the history and see what happened and who might have responded in which way to it, trying to forget that we're dealing with somebody who maybe loses his rationality. But I just want to make sure I'm not trying to justify anything. I'm not trying to excuse anything. We're just doing how history unfolded.
Can I just ask you a real quick question? I can't see that map. What's the white country next to Austria, left of it? Austria, that's
Switzerland.
Switzerland. Okay, and then what's that orange country below? Okay, just down below that orange country, little bitty orange country next to, yeah, that one, the orange country. What is that?
This is going to be maybe Kosovo or Albania or
Serbia, isn't it? No.
Here's
Right.
I think
it must be Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Yeah. And then what's that pink one below it, to the right of it, that's thinking about joining NATO, I guess? That pink one by Bulgaria. Yeah, that one.
That might be Macedonia.
Oh, as it's called now, North Macedonia. They had to give up.
Yes, that's right. North
Greece are
Macedonia.
very upset.
Yeah. The compromise over Alexander the Great. All right. So when did they leave this Russian sphere of influence? Well, Poland and Hungary, they're fast out of the blocks. They had done a revolution. Czech Republic, not far behind Germany. The people of Romania took things in their hands with Ceausescu. And the Ukraine in 1991, the Soviet Union held on a little bit longer. What was formed initially was this Commonwealth of Independent States. And I bring it up because it reappears in the Ukrainian crisis of 2014. Only Belarus gladly joined. The Baltic states, and Georgia said, "Are you kidding?" Ukraine initially joined, but they clashed so much over the Crimea and the Black Sea Fleet, which Ukraine just sunk a Russian ship. So things are not improving. And also just bear in mind, all the former Soviet states that were cut loose no longer were under a stability umbrella, and they started fighting each other. And the one that I'll highlight is Georgia and South Ossetia, because that's going to come into today's story. It's going to be settled in 2008, but they're going to fight for 20 years before it gets settled. The Ukraine prospects were pretty good. They had a fairly solid economy. there being a breadbasket, and then having people like the Ukraine, like Khrushchev, who were from the Ukraine, other prominent Ukrainians. They were politically well placed, but they had a terrible time. Not as bad as Russia, federated Russia. It was total chaos, but they lost 60% of their GDP, and they had terrible inflation. And listen, it's not a paradise. We want it to be, and it's a great hope now, but they've never got their civil society together. There have been strikes, there's ongoing corruption, and finally they get back on track about the same time that Putin stabilizes Russia. They get a new constitution, a fairly responsible leader, Kushma. Nevertheless, corruption, electoral fraud, and you're going to see there's going to be a lot of electoral disputes coming up. But one thing that they have is nukes. And so, and this is interesting because the United States Senate leads the way in dealing with this problem. What's happening to the nukes? And Barack Obama was involved with this and traveled to Eastern Europe when he was a senator, I remember. So the Russian Federation and Britain and America, they sit down and hammer out an agreement that they would respect the independence of the borders of the Ukraine, because the Ukraine, being a prominent Soviet state, had a lot of nukes. And that we were all obliged to this party to refrain from the threat or use force against the Ukraine. So you'd think this Budapest memorandum would mean something now, but it obviously it doesn't. And there is no one is to use economic coercion, but nevertheless, Russia has cut off the gas pipeline to the Ukraine 3 times. And all the signatories were to come to the aid of the Ukraine if they were a victim of aggression. That is the Budapest Memorandum is a quaint agreement now. Putin had a comment about this in his essay from last July. He commented on how terrible Ukraine was as compared to Russia. Well, he's not real objective in his viewpoint on history with the Ukraine, but he said that they helped, that Russia, although they were in total chaos, that they helped the Ukraine with considerable support. And Putin says all these things happened. They lost their powerful infrastructure, their gas transportation, their shipbuilding, their airplanes, rocket, instrument, engineering industries, world-class scientific design and engineering schools. I don't know how to evaluate that, but that's the case that Putin's making, that they can move in and restore all these things that Ukraine has not been able to manage. There's a few parallel humiliations that we have to talk about, because humiliation is the word. Putin feels this humiliation, and he's not the only one. I'm going to tell you somebody else who feels it in just a second. So Russia drags its feet in the Baltics. There's a lot of Russian speakers that live in the Baltics. And when Iko and I went through the Baltics, we saw evidence of this, plenty of evidence of it. And Russia wanted some sort of guarantee for Russian speakers, the same damn issue that is on the table in Donetsk. These new governments in the Baltic states refused. But the donor countries who were propping up Russia said, hey, they used their economic power and said, hey, get your troops out of there, quit dragging your feet. And the United Nations got involved and said, hey, you're only there because you annexed it in 1939 in a pact with Hitler. So you're there illegally. And just to recall, what was that pact that Hitler and Stalin decided as they were getting ready for war to have a quiet period so they could all gear up. Although apparently Stalin was surprised at the timing, and a week after I was born in 1941, when they started all these engines at the same time and went across this line. The noise was said to have been deafening. And a lot was made at the fun of and horror at the cynicism of this. And once again, Poland would get divided. When you look at how things were split and who got what, Hitler was generous because he knew he was going to come and take it all back fairly soon. But they went into Poland, then Russia went into the Baltics, and finally Bessarabia, which I don't know much about. Putin has this idea that he is in a similar moment, that history is repeating itself, and that it's 1939, and that Russia is about ready to be attacked again from the West, just like they were attacked by Hitler and Napoleon before him, and the king of Sweden, as Bob pointed out, in Moldova. And Putin's saying, we're not going to make the same mistake the second time. And wherever you go, when we were there, traveled in Russia in 2016, there's this constant allusion to the Great War, to World War II, everywhere, statues. And the statues of victory all point to the West. That's the direction of danger. And so when Putin talks about neo-Nazis, he's putting himself in the scenario of 1939, when in fact it's more like Britain and America in the War of 1812, trying to claw back something that they've recently lost. And Putin is still talking about the innocent people in the Donbass and the Crimea that are going to be attacked by Ukrainian nationalists. Now, there are new Ukrainian nationalists, and we'll get to that a little bit later. And some of them are every bit as nasty as our right-wing nationalists. But they're not in charge. So Russia was forced to pull back, and after receiving pleas from these countries that have been dominated by Russia for centuries, they issued invitations. Now, I know Bob and I wanted to talk about that and about George Kennan and John Mearsheimer. And they have a point. You're going to see that the four waves of NATO expansion have to have had a psychological effect. But the first wave right away is Poland, of course, because they've been constantly divided over the centuries by Russia, Germany, and Austro-Hungary. The Czech Republic, and so Hungary, they're in pretty quick by 1999, and this was the year that Putin really takes power. So he's well aware of what's going on. It's on his front burner as an issue. It's not just Putin on this issue. Here's what Gorbachev has to say. He spoke out in 1995 when it was clear, and these agreements, the invitations had been issued, and he said, hey, you're taking advantage of our weakness. You didn't consult with us. Although we see that there was an invitation at one point to Russia to join as well. And I talked about how Putin addressed that in his autobiography, but it wasn't a meaningful way with the full participation, a full voice. Russia would have liked that, to have a system where Russia was still recognized as a top player. Gorbachev complains of the arrogance and the lack of sensitivity for the historical sphere of influence. And so 1996, as early as that, people realized that America was not going to save Russia. George H.W. Bush had made very soft statements, but it wasn't going to happen. They saw that NATO was going to build up. And so as early as 1996, Russia thought about turning east. And of course, Putin has big time recently with China. And they have good enough relations with India now that India is not condemning them for the Ukraine. And obviously, neither is Iran. The second wave comes in 2002. Now it's the Baltic states' turn, along with Romania and Bulgaria, Slovenia. And there's a great basketball player in the NBA playoffs from Slovenia. It's very interesting to see that. And of course, you have our ex-First Lady from Slovenia. But they get invited, and they actually enter in 2004 as the pivotal year for our discussion today. So there, when 2004 Orange Revolution takes place in the Ukraine, all the Baltic countries have just joined NATO. And Putin, I think, has reached a maximum point of provocation. All these things that have already happened. We saw that he was very sympathetic when we were hit at 9/11. He made a trip to America. There were a few things that happened, but all NATO is happening. And then, as I said last time, I think Iraq on a scale of 1 to 10 is a 10. What we did against international law in Iraq really bothered them, as it bothered all of us. Some of us worried that it was setting a bad precedent, and oh boy, here we are. So a pivotal year. The Chechen rebellion is still smoldering. It doesn't really end until 2007, even 2009. NATO has taken that unilateral action in Kosovo. The UN had been involved in Bosnia, but they knew that they couldn't get the UN involved in Serbia because of the relationship between the fellow Orthodox Slavs in Russia and Serbia, that they weren't going to get past the Soviet veto. So the workaround was NATO. And then it was the coalition of the willing in the second Iraq war. And so the Orange Revolution in 2004 has to be seen in the light of all these other things that was going on. It doesn't excuse it, but it doesn't justify it, but it has to be seen in the light of what else had happened up until then. So there's going to be setbacks further for Russia in 2004 again, and then 2014. And together you can call these the Orange Revolutions. We know all too well the linguistic split. And this is because of all the historical factors that we've gone through. The percent of the population that speaks Russian as a first language. And the darker the red, the more, the higher the percent that speak Russian primarily at home. So unsurprisingly, you get Crimea and Donetsk, but even Kharkiv. And what's really surprising, and maybe it was Russian behavior in 2004, but now, and even the way they behaved in 2014 and the military intervention they've carried on. All these people that speak Russian primarily don't want to join Russia. And they've been fighting gallantly, probably not as gallantly as the people that live in Kiev, but well, you know, it's too early to know what's happened. We won't know for another 5 years, maybe another 20, as they say. But this is it. And then Timothy Snyder talks a lot about language, just in a theoretical sense. And then you look at voting patterns, which we will in just a second. So Putin's always made a big deal about this. And he hooked up with a power player in the Donetsk. Yankovic is from the Donetsk. And he teamed up with him and supported him in the election of 2004. The way we support people we like outside of our country, well, he did too, only there was something that didn't smell right. It was tainted in some way. You'll notice here that they're in a position of prayer with the clergy nearby. And we've already talked about the role that religion is beginning to play with Putin in the early noughts. According to Putin, it wasn't really in his book, but he says that after his wife was in that car crash and the dacha burned down, he now says before an official visit to Israel, Putin's mother gave him her cross. Now, there was nothing in his biography about his mother and her religion. And Putin says, I did as she said. I put the cross around my neck, and I've never taken it off since his trip to Israel. When asked in 2007 whether he believed in God, he said, I'm not going to talk about it. I have a sense of privacy. So he's cagey about it. At least he was in 2007. We saw at the mass rally he attended that had a heavy Orthodox theme to it. He was less cagey, but he has a confessor. Some of his close associates, and we remember Pugachev, doubt his sincerity. But on to the Orange Revolution, and people are saying, hey, we want to recount. Stop the steal, maybe. And they were serious. They continued in the face of the troops. And so they did a rerun. And with observers. And as you'd expect, Yankovic, who is from the Donetsk, from the Russian-speaking part, did the best. And this is 2004. I'm not sure you have as much of a split now, like when Zelensky. I'd like to see this map for Zelensky, but his support was heavily in the East. And Yushchenko, so who you're going to meet here in just a second, he does much better in the western part of the country, and he wins. International observers, he won pretty well, 52 to 44. Those of you here who have heard me talk know why he has a pockmarked face. The reason he has a pockmarked face, and this relates to Putin and his attitude and his willingness to take action, and the kind of action that he knows about, is he was poisoned with dioxin. This is him before he was poisoned. This was him before he had totally healed. Everybody knew something was wrong, and one of the side effects of dioxin is acne. He went to Vienna, because you'll remember the western part of the Ukraine had very tight links with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they were able to make the diagnosis. So a few more words about poisoning. I'm doing a tangent here because poisoning is a theme that continues, and this is the story of Litvinenko, who was a former KGB, who spoke out, remained a brave critic publicly of Putin, and wound up in London, fled there, and died of plutonium poisoning in a London hospital. Plutonium poisoning. The story was that somebody stuck him with an umbrella. And there's another former spy who went over, he had been a double agent, and he left, came in out of the cold, and also went to England to Salisbury, where he was poisoned with this new Novichok, the nerve agent. And you'll remember, so was Navalny. These are the two guys that security cameras caught and that are the prime suspects. And as being a nerve agent, they called 911, and this is the response to 911. And Skripal is just frozen. And they suspected it immediately something weird, so it became a hot hazmat area. But back to the Ukraine. So Yushchenko survives. The Orange Revolution is a success. And their currency, they come out with Vladimir the Great. This is Vladimir in Ukrainian. And you'll notice it's Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin. That's the difference between Russian and Ukraine. So very similar, but different enough. This is Vladimir the Great, but because it's in Kiev, we should say Voldemar. And it's been up there since 1853. They've been honoring him forever, Voldemar, in Kiev, since he founded the city and converted to. He didn't found the city. I think his grandfather did, but he was the one that converted and was baptized at the church in the Crimea. And so he's been a founding father of the city forever and honored there. This particular statue went up in 1853. And of course, it overlooks the river. We had that picture of the mass baptism at the foot in the Dnieper flowing through Kiev. Here is the new monument to Vladimir the Great, and it's in Moscow, and it went up in 2016. That's interesting. 2 years after they take over Crimea, they all of a sudden decide they have to put up a statue of Vladimir in Moscow, and it's big. It's bigger than other monuments to religious figures, and the great Alexander I, who conquered Napoleon, for Christ's sakes. So simultaneously in Georgia, you have this budding politician, Saakashvili, and his color was rose. And it was actually a little bit earlier than the Ukraine Orange. And he was a darling of the West, very cosmopolitan, embraced by Bush and Clinton. And so he was doing the same. And remember, I said early on that one of the problems with Georgia was that as soon as they were out from under the unifying umbrella of overarching Soviet administration, they started quibbling with South Ossetia about exactly where the border was between their two entities. And so Saakashvili is inaugurated, and he stays in power for 10 years. And so 2006, let's just summarize what the mindset of Russians might be. They've seen NATO in Kosovo. They've seen America ignore international law. They've seen 2 rounds of NATO expansion. Georgia is starting to talk about joining the EU. Ukraine had already opted out of the Commonwealth that was started immediately after the fall of communism, and is saying they don't want to be a client state. They don't want to accept any Russian dabbling in their election. And they're certainly not going to accept a Putin puppet. So the EU issue on the Ukraine is sort of below the surface in 2004, but it'll be on the front burner by 2014. Just to clarify, there's no resentment about Afghanistan and what we did there. Remember, Russia had been a great power and tried to tame the mullahs of Afghanistan. And they were fighting their own battle with radical Islamists in Chechnya. And they'd had their own 9/11 moments, as we saw, like in particular, the seizure of a whole theater during a performance at night. So Putin, with this mindset, starts to get suspicious of Western involvement, maybe a little paranoid, and he gets to the point, says, hey, maybe you guys were involved in juicing up Chechnya. So in his essay, he includes a shot at the West for supporting separatism and gangs of mercenaries in southern Russia, i.e. Chechnya, in Dagestan. So Putin finally solves Chechnya a few years after the Orange Revolution, and he solves it with great ruthlessness. And so some people might have predicted he would be, if he ever went into the Ukraine, he would be equally ruthless. And as I said before, Ukraine was not on his menu before he came to full power. And he mentioned it in his biography written that came out in 2000. He mentioned he mentioned Ukraine only once, a reference to a ski vacation. I know I repeat that, but in 2005, he made this statement that has been widely quoted: the collapse of the USSR, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Some of us might argue the Holocaust or Hitler, but for Putin, it meant the chaos that came from the loss of political order in the Russian traditional sphere of influence, going back to Ivan and Ivan the Terrible. So in 2007, he made a speech. Putin has always been upfront about what he's thinking. He domestically, he made a millennium speech that told the people of Russia what he was going to do and what his philosophy was, and he did it. One thing that comes out in the Fiona Hill book is a little more detail about his relation to Sobchak. You remember Sobchak was the mayor in St. Petersburg, and Putin, and Sobchak drafted Putin almost immediately on his return from Dresden after the fall of communism to help him organize. He knew Putin. He had been Putin's professor in the 1970s at law school in St. Petersburg, You remember, to get into the KGB, you have to go to law school. Well, Sobchak had been his professor. And Sobchak continued to work theoretically in the law and actually played an important role during the 90s in helping to establish the idea of the rule of law. So, and Putin has certainly observed the letter of the law, but not the spirit. But we can if we decide to talk more about Fiona Hill's book, we can talk more about that in detail. That's up to us. And somebody's coming in. That's good. Hello. And his speech in Munich to John McCain and our defense secretary and other foreign policy mavens and our elite, along with Angela Merkel, was you American neocons are violating international norms. You are. And of course, his beef is Iraq primarily, but he has some other things to say about the unipolar world of the United States. He makes an allegation that NATO had extended a promise not to expand into the new countries of Eastern Europe. And he quotes the speech of the General Secretary of NATO made in 1990. So he is 17 years later saying, hey, how about this speech? And he said that he quoted Werner as saying that NATO would not place a NATO army outside of German territory, and that the Soviet Union could take it to the bank. Where are the guarantees, says Putin? Well, there's a NATO response.
Things was not in paper. It was just a recommendation, just like George Kennan said, we shouldn't expand NATO, right? It was just
well, he said it in a public speech.
But it's not on paper that they signed.
No. But the NATO's response was, well, we've gone back and we looked back at that speech, and what Werner was talking about only concerned non-deployment of NATO forces on East German territory after reunification. So, you're splitting hairs there, and it's a legal issue that will be debated forever. But there is a case. There is a case. So in response to this victimhood that they're feeling, they retreat into an ideology of isolationism, at least in some of the more radical parts of the Russian thinking. It's in that same year that he told that press conference that nuclear weapons and Orthodox Christianity were the two pillars of Russian society, the same year that he made that speech. One guaranteeing the country's external security and nuclear weapons, and the other its moral health, reflecting Putin's religious evolution. So there's another issue that comes up in 2007 that is going to incite Russians And that takes place when the city fathers of Tallinn decide, this bronze soldier, the unknown Soviet soldier that's located at one of our busy intersections in the heart of the city, let's relocate it. And you can imagine that there would be a difference of opinion between Estonians and Russians on what to do. They did. They moved it. They put it, tucked it away in a quiet cemetery somewhere, and then they suffered a massive cyber attack, the largest such state-sponsored cyber attack behind one that China had launched with a sophistication not seen before. The upshot of that is that Estonia has become a leading center for defense against cyber attacks. And NATO said, "Wow, you guys really took it. I'll tell you what, we'll fund you if you set up an institution and you help NATO counter some of this stuff." And so the Cooperative Cyber Defense building is in Tallinn, and their protocols protect parliaments, banks, ministries, newspapers, broadcasters, and at least in NATO countries, and probably the general West, this technology. And it's been developed as a response to a Russian aggression. We're getting pretty close to the border of where we're going to have to stop. I think I can finish with Georgia. Putin then takes action, military action for the first time. No more secretly poisoning people. He sends in the tanks on the side of South Ossetia to settle that border dispute. By the way, Ramsey traveled to South Ossetia in the 1970s. I can't remember if Janet was with him, but he's got photos of South Ossetia. And this was the first European war in the 21st century. And the first war where cyber warfare coincided with military action. And information war continued before and after. And we certainly see an information war in the Ukraine today. The map, South Ossetia, now this border is secure. Here's the capital. And Abkhazia, we happen to know people that live in Abkhazia. That had been a point of contention too, and there's some settlement there now. You see it hatched, so it's some sort of compromise. And this is the detail. It was a real war. There were movements, there were deaths. And in the aftermath, the European Court of Human Rights criticized Russia for grave human rights abuses. The European Court of Human Rights. And this is the real building. So these international institutions exist. And the response was George Bush saying, okay, NATO is now offering Georgia and the Ukraine membership. So that was that's what Putin got for his action. All right, I think this is probably a good place to stop. And I'll stop the share. And I'll ask if there's any questions, comments. Yes?
You said that Putin wanted to go into an isolationist phase, but how do you justify Afghanistan? Because that was about the same time. Afghanistan would not have been very isolationist.
Well, Russian action in Afghanistan was from 1979 to 1989. And we're talking about
81.
when I say isolationism, I mean isolation from the West. There'd already been a pivot, as I said, in 1996. There'd been a pivot, realizing that America was not going to save Russia. We weren't going to launch a Marshall Plan for Russia. And so there was already that pivot in 1996. This is 7 years after they left Afghanistan. And it's just that the ideology that Putin is developing is a further doubling down on that strategy of looking east, as he's continuing to do. So when I say isolationism, I mean vis-a-vis the West. Okay.
Well, maybe just a comment on the focus we have on buildings and neighborhoods and cities being destroyed, which we're seeing now in Ukraine. And of course, we're horrified by that, horrified more by the killing of women and children and others. But I mean, you mentioned before, Russia has been doing this for a while. They did it obviously in Chechnya and so on, and parts of probably Georgia as well, South Ossetia. But if you go back to just a little bit further back, I think it was 1993. Do you remember Yeltsin shelling the Parliament building in Moscow? I mean, there was kind of like, well, if they're not going to be on our side, you know, he was having difficulties with Parliament. They wanted someone else to be president, I think, of Russia. He just turned the tanks on the Parliament building and bombed it. And they say about, I don't know, 150 people died. Others say 2,000 people died in that. That's on their own Parliament building. We think about that. If they're willing to do that in downtown Moscow, within spitting distance of the Kremlin, what they're doing in Mariupol is like nothing.
Yeah, but I think the argument would be that Russia has had times of troubles, all right? And there have been 4 distinct times of troubles, and certainly the early 90s in particular. You'd think that Yeltsin by then would have had things under better control, but you remember how Yeltsin came to power. It was in a coup against Gorbachev. The Soviet Union still existed, and Gorbachev, everything was falling apart with all the satellites leaving, but the Gorbachev was still in charge of a rump Soviet Union. It hadn't completely collapsed, but the army saw that it would, and it launched a coup against Gorbachev. And you'll remember Yeltsin came out and famously confronted a tank and then climbed up on top of the tank and gave a speech. And that was that. Yeltsin, by the way, was a real risk taker. You read biographies, the risk takers of the world, like Fidel Castro, for instance. It's amazing. He lived as long as he did. He was a cat with 9 lives. Well, Yeltsin was the same way. And if you ever seen I think I showed the picture of Yeltsin as a kid, he's got a finger blown off from playing with a grenade. So he was a risk taker and foolhardy, and Yeltsin in the tank. I guess there are 2 episodes: one where he's the hero, and one where he's the villain.
Yeah, well, I suppose in a way my point doesn't hold much water, because I'm trying to point out that there's not much regard for buildings and residential and factories, but they can all be rebuilt. But and I was trying to make a point that that's peculiarly Russian, but I suppose it isn't, because we just in, was it 2016, completely flattened a huge ancient city, Mosul. And we didn't have much compunction about doing that ourselves. So I guess I withdraw my point.
Well, and then where Putin was in his final days as a foreign officer was Dresden. He served in the ruins of Dresden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think that I mean, you know, Putin looks at what America did in the Middle East, and he's just doing the same thing.
Well, I think what he's doing in Syria is an example of what Bob's talking about. The tactics that he's using in Syria, Aleppo, are kind of maybe betray a Russian, same kind of Russian callousness that we saw in Chechnya, we see in the Ukraine, and also in Syria. So, Bob, your point is gaining ground.
No, I'm actually trying to weaken my point, because I'm also thinking about what we've been doing indirectly in Yemen. We don't even know what towns and cities have been destroyed in Yemen. We don't see anything, and it's with our weapons supply, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And one last comment on, you had a slide there which said Putin said he's got to go into Ukraine and rebuild their shipbuilding industry and et cetera, et cetera. You know, I haven't to notice this, the Moskva, which was sunk or sank last week, that was built in Mykolaiv in Ukraine, in an enormous shipbuilding plant they have there. It was the major builder of ships, military ships for the Soviet Union.
Really?
And you know, Mykolaiv has been under fire and attempted being surrounded and captured for the last 7-8 weeks. And so the Moskva was one of 4 of that class, the Slava class destroyer. And the 4th one was never finished. There was a plan to build 10 of them. They're all built in Mykolaiv. And not only that, the Moskva was then used in 2014 to blockade the remains of the Ukrainian Black Sea Fleet, which shared bases or had a base very close to Sevastopol in Crimea. So even after Crimea was taken, the Ukrainians still had their naval base there. It was blockaded, and the blockade was led by the Moskva. But then an agreement was reached with the Ukrainians for the Ukrainian fleet, I think there were 14 ships, to leave the Crimea and sail, I presume, to Odessa or another port on the Black Sea. And so the Moskva crew, the captain and crew, were given a special award for that blockade of the Ukrainian fleet. It goes on and on. There's another odd one which is a frigate, which also has been damaged, but there hasn't been much reporting on that. It's called the Admiral Essen, which is a Russian frigate. It's named after, it has a German name, Admiral Essen, because so many of the naval commanders back in, I don't know whether it was the 18th century and 19th century, were Baltic Germans. And so this ship was actually built in what was Königsberg, became Kaliningrad, and there's a shipyard there, became a state-owned shipping company, shipbuilder, which just 8 years ago bought a shipbuilding factory in Finland. And to this day, this Admiral Essen, which was built in Kaliningrad, was built by the company, which now owns a ice building specializing in icebreakers in Finland. I mean, the complications of what goes on when you start these confrontations is extraordinary. And they're still building icebreakers, and it's a Russian company now.
So you bring up the German names, and I can't resist just quickly making the connection. Of course, Catherine the Great was German, and she'd been fixed up by Frederick the Great because he wanted his finger in the Russia pie, and she was aware at one point that the Cossacks were not good farmers down in particularly the Volga basin. I guess Ukraine, the bottom part of all these drainage is wetlands, right? And the only people that could make a living there were Cossacks, and they didn't know how to drain and plant. But she knew that the Germans did, and there was something going on in the Palatine state of Germany, and she said, you know what? Let's get those farmers to come over to the Volga. They don't have to pay taxes. You won't have to serve in the military, and above all, you won't have to pay a beer tax. And so they came and they lived there for a couple of centuries until the Cossacks down there got sour grapes and said, "Hey, that's not fair." And so the Russians said, "Okay, Volga Germans, you're going to have to do in the military, pay taxes, etc." And at that time, a recruiter from Southern Pacific realized that he could go there and recruit these Volga Germans who were trapped to come and live along the Southern Pacific Rail line. And Texas was the land that was open at that time. So these Volga Germans came up through Galveston and settled in the hill country. And the reason I know this is Lyndon Johnson, barely 2 months after Kennedy had been assassinated, entertained Erhard, the Chancellor of Germany, at the ranch. He decided he didn't want to be around Washington during the holidays. So he took Erhard to the ranch, and he took him to the hill country and to these little homes where the descendants of the Volga Germans still had the portrait of Catherine the Great over the mantel.
But I think also, that's a great story. I think also some Volga Germans somehow ended up in the Central Valley. And I tell you why I know this, because I know he's 80-something years old. He's still learning. He wanted to learn German. He was a professor at Berkeley, it's a man I know, in agriculture, but also his father had become the primary or a huge grower of raisin production, of grapes and raisin production, and was the chair of the California Raisin Board, and he was a direct descendant of a Volga German. Anyway, his son, who's now 80 years old, belatedly is trying to learn German. And
Okay.
he's in this sort of class that I go to. And he's today the president of the United States, of the Vulgar German Society, and he goes every year to a conference in Nebraska. All these vulgar Germans.
Yeah, it's a wonderful connection. That's why we all love history. If I can remember, I'll send you some of my slides when we presented this, when we did the history of Russia. Okay,
good.
Okay, anything else, folks? So be thinking. I think I can. I'm going to stop because it's not history after 2014. I'll mention a few things that have happened after that, but I'm not going to try to deal with it comprehensively at all. You guys know more about it from reading the newspapers than I do. So after we finish 2014, I think I can do it next week. We need to think about what to do after that. Be thinking. We could go back and replow some of the history of the Ukraine through Fiona Hill's lens, not implementing her identity analysis, but just there are quite a few little tidbits of history. I'd like to go through the 90s and the knots with a little bit more of Putin, the influences on Putin, particularly in that 20-year period. But it's up to you. We're a study group that can decide what we want to do. And if we want to get back to the Silk Road, that's okay by me. If we want to do something else, that's okay by me. Just as long as we keep our minds active and keep looking for these wonderful connections that history provides. And with old brains, old brains are not as good for a lot of things, but they're really good at making interesting connections.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
Bye-bye.